Christian, how are you, man?
Doing great, Peter. Excited to be on What Bitcoin Did and chatting with you.
Well, we should be saying this is your first appearance. It kind of is, but I'll explain to everyone in a minute what's going on here. It's kind of your first appearance, kind of your second appearance.
I'm excited
Breedlove,
though.
how are you? Yeah, it's going to be fun. Breedlove, how are you?
I'm good. Glad to be here, guys.
Right, so let's set this up. This is the second recording of this episode. So me and Christian recorded a couple of weeks ago this concept, the sovereign company, based on an article Christian had been working on. And then since then, we have the Tesla news, and me and Breedlove in the background have also been working on this sovereign individual show idea. So I spoke to Christian a couple of days ago. I said, look, let's do this again. We've got new information. Let's bring Breedlove in and let's make this a monster. So, but it's still kind of your first appearance, Christian. So welcome on. I've known you for since pretty much starting What Bitcoin Did. You've been around since the start, so it's good to do something with you finally.
Yeah, no, it's been an awesome journey. I remember I contacted you after the Roger Ver show in 2018, and I was like, "Yo, you got something going on here." And from there, we started collaborating a little bit with the Let's Talk Bitcoin network, and it's just been amazing to see you and the show grow.
I think that was episode 18, so that was like 3 years ago. Jesus. All right, listen, I'm gonna let Breedlove take the floor first because of the work he's doing, the articles he's been writing, the research he's been doing. A lot of people will have heard about the sovereign individual. I know Breedlove, you'll say, just fucking buy the book and read it. I'm about 3/4 of the way through, but we will have people who are going to tune into this show. They've not read the book yet. So let's do the setup. Explain what the sovereign individual is about.
Well, there's a lot. The super high level is that we could say that the shape of society, or the shape of the way we organize ourselves into socioeconomic systems, tends to reflect the technologies that we use to collaborate with one another. So the high level overarching thesis is that the 20th century industrial age had the large top-down nation state because we were dealing with large industrial equipment and industrial effort, right? We spent a lot of the 20th century actually mobilizing resources from the earth to build buildings, to create capital, to make stuff, et cetera, et cetera. And the thesis of the book was that the microprocessor, or digital technology, would subvert and destroy the nation state as an organizing model for humanity. And the big impetus for that initially is, and this is on like page 25 of the book. If you look at pages 24, 25, it goes super deep on what I believe they call anonymous digital cyber cash, what we would call basically Bitcoin. And I made the point that once people had this option to store their capital in a medium that was uninflationary and could not be confiscated, that everyone would figure out the calculus behind this. That it's just better to hold money that doesn't inflate or can't be confiscated easily, let's say, and that over time all monetary capital would move into this medium, and this would essentially 100 or near 100% deprecate the revenue model of the state, because the state only bases its revenue model on taxation and inflation. So this taxation-resistant and inflation-proof money that they called anonymous digital cyber cash would be the catalyst for bankrupting the nation-state model, effectively. And then it goes deep into other tech, but I think that's kind of the high-level setup.
And Christian, the book had a huge influence on you, right? You love this book.
Yeah, so I currently own like 9 copies of the book, and I always maintain a nice stash for when I meet Bitcoiners in person. I make sure that they have a physical copy. I've also shipped like 25 copies to Romania to Vlad, who I'm sure that you guys know each other quite well. But he let me know back in the day when he was working for Bitcoin Magazine that you can't get it in Eastern Europe easily. So I was like, we need to distribute physical copies of this book around the world. That's how freaking important this book is. So I've been passing these out like Bibles effectively, and it's just such a prescient book. It was published in 1997 and is just uses first principles logic and thinking and understanding to predict an unprecedented amount of things that are coming true today, and I would say is very, very, very directionally correct.
But what was the kicker for you when you're reading it? Like, what was the trigger point for you? Like, okay, you made the connections. You realize, because look, the thing about Bitcoin is we've heard a lot of these predictions even before everyone was talking about the sovereign individual. But sometimes in your head they're like, yeah, but really, I mean, really, are we going to see the fall of the nation state? Really, are we going to see sovereign individuals? What was the kicker for you?
So, I mean, I started reading the book as a Bitcoiner. It was, one of those books that the people I respected the most, like, continuously kind of brought up. But yeah, I mean, I think the fact that in 1997 on page 24 and 25 that they go deep on censorship resistant, inflation resistant digital cash, that is pretty eye opening. But it has a very nice historical context as well. So some people consider this to be the drier part of the book, but smack dab in the middle really goes through how throughout history, technology has changed how we organize, and it kind of gives a nice framework for understanding how things like gunpowder, things like the printing press, these things have, fundamentally changed how we organize. And it's not like, I think a lot of people think like, oh, we all come to consensus with how we want to organize. That's not the case. Technology comes, that changes the logic of violence, that changes the logic of, storing your wealth, and that influences how you live. So they then kind of go and look forward into the digital age, and they use first principles thinking to kind of forecast, with a microprocessor, with all of these new innovations, with the world uploading to the web, like we've seen in dramatic fashion in 2021, what does that mean, and what is that going to do to how we organize? And again, if you want to understand what Bitcoin is doing to the world, I think that, again, the best book possible to read.
My favorite bit of the book is the bit the bit you're referring to, the history lesson where it talks about how we went from hunter gatherers and how much land we needed. I can't remember what it was. It was something like, was it 25 acres for a group of 50 people or something, whatever. And then through technology and through innovation, people migrated to building farms, and then farms they had to store the crop, and then people tried to steal the crop. And that kind of like evolution of humans and how we organize ourselves and use technology, and then takes us all the way up to the point of where we are today and the nation state, and beyond that, I found really, really kind of interesting. And I don't know about you, Robert, but I guess in the way you see it, there's going to be like future textbooks that look back on this stage of statism as a purely just another period.
Yeah, this just comes to mind, but Christian, I think I can credit you with me finally reading this book. It was recommended to me by a lot of people in Bitcoin circles, but I think we had a dinner in LA or something, and you were like, no, you really need to read this book. And I went home and like bought it that night and read it. So that just came to mind in this interview.
I remember that dinner.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
so,
Korean barbecue.
That's right. It was Korean barbecue. Yeah. So thanks for that, because this book has been tremendously influential in my thinking. But something else that I've learned recently was actually talking to Saylor, and his overarching thesis on humanity, I guess, is that humans are, I guess you could say this, the purpose of life is to channel energy across time and space toward the achievement of some end. Right? That's what really life is. It's harnessing energy and then trying to essentially proliferate itself across space and time. What distinguishes humans, though, is that we can channel energy more intelligently, or you could say towards higher and more sophisticated ends than any other animal in the world. Right? We can coordinate our actions through the use of symbols, telling of stories. This is like the classic. I think the phrase Naval used was, you can organize 100,000 men under a flag on a battlefield, right? It's just an idea. But for a chimpanzee troop, they can only organize themselves in groups of like 150 strong. So it's this ability, if we consider our own efforts a form of energy, right? We can organize human energy at scale in a way that no other species can, and that's why we dominate the world. So it seems to me like you could even look at the way we organize ourselves. It is a device itself. So capitalism or the nation state or socialism, these different forms of statism, they're a tool in and unto themselves, and the real purpose of that tool is to organize a peaceful society that can generate wealth through trade, at least ostensibly. Like we know with communism, trade sort of collapses, and that's why it actually loses out to a tool like capitalism. So I think that this takes us, this Bitcoin breakthrough takes us to it enables a new form of organization that was never before possible. We like to say that, in the US that we're free market capitalists, but we know that every nation state in the world is centered on a communist structure, actually called the central bank, right? It's the central command and control of money, where there is no free market experimentation or iteration allowable. That's what's handicapping humanity right now, is we have this bureaucratic or communist stranglehold on the free market in the most important market in the world, which is money, right? It's one side of every transaction. So in terms of how I know it sounds totally crazy today that the nation state could fall or fragment, but these, as Christian pointed out earlier, it's not about our wishes. We don't all sit down at a table and decide how we're going to organize ourselves. It's the technological realities that prevail at the time that determine how we organize ourselves. How easy is it to project power over time? How easy is it to defend from the projection of power? And encryption technology basically changes the game. So the mathematical point that I think really drove it home for me when I read the book was this savings on inflation and taxation. So average U.S. citizen today pays about $10,000 per year in direct taxes. That does not include inflation. If they were instead able to take that $10,000 per year and put it into a savings account that yielded 10% per year, that after 40 years, which is like the average working life, that equals $4.4 million in savings. So with the emergence of something like Bitcoin, the question for the average American paying $10,000 in annual tax per year becomes, would you switch your savings account for $4.4 million in retirement savings? And that this not that people cognitively understand this yet today, but this calculus sort of forces itself on market participants, such that the more governments overreach and try to increase taxes or increase inflation, the more people are pressured into this offshore bank of Bitcoin.
So, Christian, while a lot of people have been looking at the idea of the sovereign individual, you went down the rabbit hole of considering kind of the sovereign company and the role that plays in this kind of future world. Give me the background to why you looked at this as a subject.
Yeah, so the really what I see here is we now have new monetary technology. This monetary technology has fantastic properties that, like Robert kind of indicated, have very real fiscal benefits to using the old technology. And I just saw it as a no-brainer that, yes, companies are already pushing the realm of sovereignty. Google, Apple, the massive network effects tech companies that are operating globally. These companies, in some cases, are, stronger than Western massive nation states. And in every case, they're stronger than every small, tiny, insignificant nation state. So, what is it going to take for them to kind of take that next step in sovereignty and separate completely from nation states? And I just see that as the path of least resistance for, kind of that next step towards breaking down nation state borders. And it really wasn't, an idea that was far outside the book. The book talked about this, that the economy is being uploaded to the internet that allows you to do business anywhere, and people are going to start optimizing geographically where they're located in order to take advantage of the financial and business operation benefits of kind of being globally dispersed. And this idea of geographical arbitrage or jurisdictional arbitrage, like that is what Bitcoin enables. It enables people, and the internet enables this, is it enables people to pick and choose where they do business and have, kind of this opportunity to do business in a better jurisdiction, a jurisdiction that is friendlier to Bitcoin, in a taxation from a legal compliance perspective, but serve the entire world. So I just saw that as like the lowest hanging fruit, really, on like this next step of this evolution towards a smaller government sovereign world. So I mean, that was kind of, the impotence for writing that. And I really look and see the Bitcoin exchange ecosystem as being like, especially the offshore exchanges, as being kind of that first beta version of this idea of a sovereign company, a company that is operating in the jurisdiction that is suits them best, and they are globally distributed to make them difficult to kind of take down. They have all of their value in Bitcoin, so outside of the financial system, and that makes them very anti-fragile, but yet they can easily serve the entire globe, including American customers. Granted, those American customers jump through some hoops. So I mean, just seeing that example, seeing kind of BitMEX's resilience against the U.S., and then just kind of like try to forecast what that looks like if a bigger, more powerful, more legitimate company starts moving in that direction.
I think we should expand into that and talk about the BitMEX thing and what actually happened, because that will give some context to what you've just explained
Sure.
here.
Yeah. So I mean, many people who are in the Bitcoin community and have been listening to this show, they're very familiar with BitMEX. And earlier in 2020, I think it was the CFTC and other American agencies. They arrested Sam Reed, who is a co-founder of BitMEX based in Boston. They effectively ordered BitMEX to shut down for, violating U.S. laws, and they put out warrants for arrest for all of the co-founders. So normally when this happens, business immediately shuts down. Funds are frozen. The exchange stops operating, and then the business has to kind of go into the courtroom and play by the nation state's rules. That did not happen for BitMEX. BitMEX is a very unique company in that they are 100% Bitcoin based, so none of their funds could have been frozen. They never ceased withdrawals of funds. They never ceased operating business, and they actually kind of they had the ability to call their shots, right? So they never stopped business, like I said. They switched out their management team, and no one outside of Sam ever was in the custody of the United States. And now Sam, while he can't travel, he is effectively free in the U.S. and and is again playing on his rules, right? He lawyered up, he had his funds, like they're defendable, right? So I think that this is a great preview on like what is going to happen and how resilient these companies are going to become when they adopt Bitcoin.
Breedlove, just thinking about the idea of a sovereign individual, for a lot of people, it's a transitionary phase where you start to adopt some of the technologies and the tactics to become part self-sovereign. We know of certain people. There's I did an interview with Max Hillerbrand. He's essentially a digital nomad. He's probably a lot more self-sovereign than say I am. I'm tied to the UK. I've got kids here. I've got a house. I've got a mortgage. I've got a registered company. So there is this transitional period. How do you think about the idea that somebody is kind of a part self-sovereign, and how do you think about the idea of being completely self-sovereign?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly exists on a gradient between being just full on under the control of a nation state versus kind of 1 foot out into digital space. The other analogy that the book uses that I really liked, that made a lot of sense, is they refer what they call cyberspace, which I've been calling digital space in my writing because I think it's more apt for a more apt description. They analogize it to the high seas. They say that essentially because this domain, there's maritime law is very different from jurisdictional law, and in the high seas, basically because there's this, it's so it's impossible or very costly to project dominion into the high seas and maintain monopolistic control there that no one really does, right? The best we can do is monitor the waters and defend them to protect the terrestrial monopoly that the nation state holds. But no one can really hold, like we can't say like this is the American Ocean or anything like that. And so the high seas have basically become this refuge for anyone that wants to do anything condemned by the nation state, whether that's gambling or buying things duty free or whatever it may be. So they analogize digital space to that, saying that it is this cosmically vast domain where you can basically cloak yourself behind encryption. You can detach yourself from your identity in digital space. So you can achieve these levels of self-sovereignty that are just before the information age were not even thinkable, not even remotely possible. And the other advantage of that is you can be, in many ways, non-local, right? So when government tries to crack down on a BitMEX, these guys it's just like a fluid organization, right? They're just on servers, they're on Bitcoin. They can really roll that to anywhere in the world, anywhere with an internet connection. And that's exactly what happened. And I guess the other thing is people tend to think that this all sounds rather fanciful or like science fiction, but Dan Held dropped this in one of his recent newsletters, actually, about old examples of companies becoming rivalous to the state, like establishing so much sovereignty that they were their own sort of little nation state. We look at something like the Dutch East India Company, which had 40 warships and 10,000 private soldiers defending this far-flung spice empire. They had these long spice trading networks that they were actively defending, like a nation state. The British East India Company controlled a large colonial empire. They had 300,000 strong standing army. This was in the mid-19th century. And then ultimately that was kind of dissolved into the British Empire eventually. So this company sort of merged back into the state over time. And then there was the Hudson's Bay Company, which is the largest landowner in the world and controlled a big territory called Rupert's Land, which at one point was 15% of the landmass in North America. So there's this, to Christian's thesis, there's this big incentive really for companies to gain this autonomy as well, this sovereignty, because they're in the crosshairs of nation states more so than individuals even, because they're larger, they represent a larger tax base, and they're more. It's easier for a government to deal typically with a large organization because they're centralized, right? You can go straight to the management group, and you could historically you could seize their funds or freeze their funds or force them into some unfavorable tax agreement. So with that pressure from nation states, there's a commensurate incentive for companies to become more and more self-sovereign. So we think to increasingly play this jurisdictional arbitrage game, and to do that effectively, you need to adopt Bitcoin. So there are pressures even beyond the fiscal and monetary that we discussed earlier that actually get into more of the sphere of sovereignty itself.
Well, this is why Tesla is such an interesting case study, and also the reason we're re-recording this, because it plays a really important part of the narrative here. So when you talk about, Christian, you've talked about regulatory arbitrage, and yourself there, Breedlove. What happened with Tesla when, during the coronavirus in California, when they had the massive restrictions on them, essentially they made the decision to move out to Austin, right? That was pretty sure that was a big influencing factor on certainly Elon moving anyway. And I'm trying to remember, didn't they move a factory? Did they move a factory because of that?
Yeah, I think that they're moving a lot of their operations, including production.
Is it the operation? Yeah. So when you think about it, yeah, Elon Musk is one of those people. He doesn't really give a fuck too much about the government and the state, he'll happily challenge them. I mean, he's got the weight, right? He's got the clout and the ability to do that. So actually, it kind of feels like it was almost natural for them to become one of the first big companies to adopt Bitcoin the way they've done. I mean, like, I know Square adopted Bitcoin, but it was 50 million. We're talking about 1.5 billion here. So again, Breedlove, how much of this do you think this is Tesla protecting revenues, and how much do you think this is Tesla recognizing like a transitional stage and actually requiring themselves to be self-sovereign?
Again, I'm not sure how much this is. I mean, I'm sure they have to be thinking about it, right? As governments escalate their unfavorable tax treatment of companies, this has to be discussed in boardrooms and at the management level. I don't know if they're discussing self-sovereignty per se at this point, but it sort of only goes that direction. The big thing with Elon, if I recall correctly, there was a California politician. I don't even remember her name. I don't pay attention to politics much. I think she tweeted at Elon like, "Fuck you," basically. Right? I mean, what kind of world are we living in? These are elected officials meant to serve their constituents, of which Elon is one of the largest, probably, contributing constituent to the state in terms of tax revenue. And here she is going on a social media platform and just saying "fuck you." Like, it just blows my mind that someone would shoot themselves in the foot like that. But that's kind of the outcome you get, I think, with a really bloated bureaucracy.
Yeah, we've got it here. It's Democratic San Diego Assemblywoman Lorena Gonzalez issued a strident response to Tesla CEO Elon Musk's threat to relocate his company's headquarters out of California. She tweeted, "Fuck Elon Musk." And then I've just seen next to this that last summer Tesla revealed that its newest automobile factory will be built just east of Austin in Del Valle. I don't know, I can't pronounce that correctly maybe. And in November, Musk's transit-orientated underground tunneling project, the Boring Company, announced that it is expanding to Austin. There you go.
Optionality keeps counterparties honest, right? If I'm a bank customer with you and I've got $1 billion in your bank, you're going to be much more likely to deal with me fairly if you know that I have an exit option. If I have either other competitors I can go into or Bitcoin or anything else. Sometimes the power to do a thing, the option to do a thing, is even more effective than actually doing it. It just keeps, there's a symmetry of relationship, right? And this is what Bitcoin and the digital age enables, is it levels the playing field, I guess, between nation state and individual and corporation, such that we, the companies and individuals, gain this unprecedented level of optionality, which forces the nation state to be more fair in its dealings. And in the long term, per the thesis of this book, forces governments to compete and earn citizenship versus just harvesting us, which they do today, right? We just get a tax bill. It's just, here's your rate, here's what you owe us. You have no say-so in this matter whatsoever. We provide whatever services we want, and we charge whatever we want, and you have to pay it. That top-down command and control, monopolistic control, will not hold in the digital age where people have this unprecedented level of optionality.
It's you're essentially talking about the idea that Balaji talks about, which is like the 10,000 cities thesis, in that it's in some ways it's a better form of democracy, in that, and I think Rogan was talking about this with Musk this week, where they talked about essentially in some states your vote has zero impact. It doesn't matter what you do in California, it's going to be a blue state. But you can, but your foot has a lot more impact. You can leave, you can move yourself, your company, your tax revenues to another state, and we're seeing that impact now. We're seeing it with Mayor Francis, what he's doing in Miami. We've seen what's happened in Wyoming. Andrew Yang's just come out now and said if he becomes mayor of New York, he's going to make it a hub for Bitcoiners. It's quite interesting times, because in some ways they're kind of taking themselves on a journey to their own irrelevance.
Well, so I would argue that it's not their own irrelevance, and that this ability, at least in the United States, to kind of have domestic jurisdictional arbitrage is actually what has made the United States great all along. So we discussed this, Peter. You are in the UK. It doesn't matter which which county you live in, which city you live in. What happens in London is the law, and you have no choice. It doesn't matter how draconian it is. But in the US, there's this friction and optionality. And guess what? Things can be horrible here in California. But, for the last 3 weeks, I got haircuts and went out to bars in Utah because it was available and I could just drive there easily. My money still works. Everything still works. The identity system still works. So jurisdictional arbitrage is the game. Okay, Bitcoin is just a key, a tool to allow jurisdictional arbitrage for individuals. And I would argue that companies have been taking advantage of jurisdictional arbitrage far before individuals have, right? A Delaware company in the United States, that is jurisdictional arbitrage. Apple holding all of their funds in Ireland and Dublin, that's jurisdictional arbitrage. And that is only going to increase as, people start to adopt Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is that common globally, neutral settlement layer, and it allows for that, the kind of the property rights that enabled inter-domestic jurisdictional arbitrage in the U.S. to kind of happen everywhere, and it really flattens the world, as Anthony Scaramucci has said.
We would call this jurisdictional arbitrage. It's just market competition, right? It's just like, if I don't like the service you're providing me, I'll go to your competitor. And that's what, to Christian's point, companies have been doing that, playing that game forever. We have these reverse mergers into, Ireland-based shell companies to keep funds offshore so they don't have to repatriate and pay taxes. You're driving to Utah to do things like this. Is just the digital age. I guess the other thing is, with information flowing freely and not with businesses and the value they create less rooted to the locality of any jurisdiction, it just pushes this free market paradigm on governments. And that's what we're seeing happen, right? They're being forced to compete just like every other enterprise on the planet.
The funny thing about Apple and Ireland, what happened there was the EU ordered Apple to pay $13 billion in basically in back taxes to the Irish government. And the Irish government didn't want it. They're like, we don't want this, because if they had to pay those taxes, they were missing out on the the beneficial tax arrangement that Ireland was offering it. Because Ireland was part of the EU, it was seen as anti-competitive, which is why a lot of people actually were in favour of Brexit, because we don't have this opportunity to have this kind of competition.
I mean, you could argue that the EU is kind of the perfect example of going backwards. Like, Europe actually was more decentralized, and it had a lot more kind of the US effect before the EU, and then since the bureaucracy took over, they've just stifled that competition.
Well, we saw what happened recently with the AstraZeneca vaccines. That they were struggling on this. I think it was like their second batch of deliveries, and the UK had obviously got their orders in nice and early. The EU was pissed off about this, and they actually wanted to block delivery of orders that had already been made, just because they're in a slow process. I think the Brexit and what's happening with the UK now has highlighted the problems of that bureaucracy. But you make a really good point, Christian. Like, I'm here in the UK, right? It doesn't matter where I live in the country, I've got the same shit rules. The only way I have any jurisdictional arbitrage is to leave the country, which is actually very difficult if you've got children. Now, if it was regional, say I could move to the next county, you might think about it, but to leave the country, it's almost not going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, underrated in the U.S. People think it's the democracy, it's all this stuff, states' rights. And that's why when I see folks celebrating red states flipping blue or vice versa, I'm like, you don't even get it. Like, you don't get what makes this country great. Is we want to have a massive diversity so that way consumers and people have maximum choice. And I'm like, I don't really align with either party. I'm more or less just localized. So I love seeing what's happening with the mayor of Miami, and kind of what the after effects of there. And again, like, when it comes to okay, who can leave their country easily? Who, like, let's just zoom out. We're not only talking about folks in the U.S. Like, this is a particular feature of the U.S. that makes it hospitable for citizens to kind of have this jurisdictional arbitrage. But on a state level, on a country level, companies, I think, are a lot more in position to take advantage of leaving, relocating. And again, now that more and more of commerce of the economy is uploading to the internet, the high seas, as Robert puts it, it's going to become easier and easier to relocate. And then if you're holding Bitcoin, to kind of separate your money from the financial system. And then all of a sudden, you can you find yourself in a position where you're shopping around jurisdictions. You have a lot more flexibility with where you go. Your money works everywhere. You can accept payments from anyone, anywhere, and that is going to have a massive effect. Ultimately, I think the long-term end result of this is borders changing. But I want to kick it over to Robert.
The idea of borders, that just the strongest military in the room gets to draw these imaginary lines around a group of people, and then what actually the sovereign individual calls this a tax farm, effectively. So the intention or the purpose of the nation state is to secure that border such that there is peace within it and that people can trade and create wealth. So effectively, the border becomes this mechanism for securing private property rights peacefully, right? So not only are we recording ledgers of say who owns what, but we also have these mechanisms of nonviolent dispute resolution, like the rule of law. So if someone infringes on your property rights, you don't have to raise a militia and go conquer them. You can sort of depend on the court system to get retribution instead. And that, a lot of that purpose and functionality just is provided orders of magnitude more cheaply by something like Bitcoin and software more generally. So I think it'll be really interesting to see. I guess that the one test case we have of this was when U.S. capitalism basically outcompeted Soviet communism in the 20th century, and we saw the USSR fall. It fragmented back into the states it had previously conquered. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Like, as Bitcoin bankrupts the nation-state model, will countries just fragment? One example would be Texas in the U.S. I think in their state constitution, they have an inbuilt option to become their own sovereign state. So maybe we'll see something like that happen. But I wonder too if, and I think about this a lot, how will property rights be handled post nation state collapse? So actually, like your property rights, say in your home or an equities portfolio or other forms of property, I would suspect that these will become more local. First of all, I would expect they'd become digitized because there's a lot of efficiency gains there by just there's an Oracle problem to be solved, but there's a lot of efficiency gains if you can get a property right into a distributed digital database that's managed by software versus a centralized bureaucratic database. But I would expect too that the enforcement of those property rights will become more localized again. So you'll see government sort of in the digital age revert back to its free market origins, which were in the agricultural age, actually, when property rights first emerged. When we first started creating savings in the form of grain, livestock, foodstuff, shelter, this was the original form of capital, and that's when property rights actually emerged. And when that property emerged, the service provider that protected it, that secured its border from external threat, was government. That's where government came from. So I think the digital age sort of reverts the large centralized nation state model back towards this localized protection service that government began as.
There's one slight issue with that, in that a lot of the ideas behind, say, Christian's article with the sovereign company is that a lot of companies these days are virtual. Essentially, let's say I run a virtual business. Like, my staff are globally distributed. I've got people in the US, I've got people in Australia. I pay people digitally. I could pay them in Bitcoin. I can't get a bank account at the moment, which is the most mind-blowing thing at the moment. Can't get a bank account. I've applied to 5 banks and been rejected by each one for different reasons. So I'm operating pretty much without a bank account. But that doesn't matter. I can do it, right? I hold the majority of the company's money in Bitcoin. But a lot of the companies, therefore, I deal with are international as well. They're not local. So if I was to have some kind of contract dispute with another company, how would you enforce that in the digital world? Because we do have the nation state to enforce contracts and to enforce the resolution of contracts. You do pay potential fines or whatever scenario. How do you enforce that in the digital world?
There's a great piece written by Parabolic Trav on Twitter, and he has a partner on that piece whose name I can't recall at the moment. I highly encourage everyone to go out and read this. It's called Bitcoin Contract Governance. And he describes a model where you can actually use multi-signature schema on top of Bitcoin to provide this form of decentralized contract law enforcement. And it's, it depends on the nature of the contract. Clearly, it's the more objective the terms are, the more dry code the relationship, the more easily it is to enforce this way. But the truth is that it's not actually the state that's enforcing the contract law. It's the contract is really enforced between the parties initially, right? Like you agree, you have a spirit of the agreement, you embody that in terms, and then it's only when there's a dispute that can't be reconciled either directly or via arbitration that you then take recourse to the state and file a lawsuit or do whatever. So it's almost like this contract is governed in the shadow of the state in a way. It's just saying like, look, if you don't do this, I'm gonna take this option. It's like again, like we talked earlier, the option to do something is what's important. I have the option to take this to the courts and sue you if we don't find alternative means of reconciling it. So with this Bitcoin contract governance model, it actually, which also will be mind-blowing in how disruptive potentially Bitcoin actually is, it could disrupt the centralized jurisdictional court model. You could have this free market of, and I've only read the piece once, so I don't know it in detail, but essentially it was a free market of arbitrators that you could have, party A, party B to a multi-sig contract, and then party C is this arbitrator that you've picked up in the free market. And then if there's any dispute, you have recourse to the arbitrator who will make a decision based on certain criteria and can decide on the release of funds. So there is a free market component to this. I'm not too equipped to speak to it fully intelligently today, but there is an alternative out there, and I encourage you guys to read that piece.
So, Christian, one of the interesting things with becoming self-sovereign as an individual is quite easy. And if we're honest, we've had a good 10-year run where we can front run the corporations. This latest Bitcoin run is really being dominated by the idea of companies putting their treasuries into Bitcoin. Sailor was the starting point, really. But we've seen Square, we've seen this Tesla move. I'm sure lots of other companies are thinking about it, but we've had 10 years to front run them. I'm also thinking in the idea of like a sovereign company. It is actually the small, nimble companies, like ones like myself with 4 or 5 employees, globally distributed, where the entire business is online. I have the opportunity to kind of front run the larger companies to become this kind of sovereign company. Do you recognize that?
Yeah, so I think the word sovereign is a tricky word because ultimately to be sovereign you kind of have to be the top dog, right? So very, very few organizations are going to actually become sovereign, but in the process of becoming like kind of censorship resistant and anti-fragile, there is an opportunity to bloom into what could be a sovereignty. So again, that's kind of a big reason why I focus in on companies with this article, because I just recognize that multinational global corporations are the closest things to taking their sovereignty back completely. So when I think of your business, I think you can use Bitcoin and jurisdictional arbitrage to become extremely anti-fragile and, start flirting with sovereignty. But it's going to take a little bit more scale for you to become a sovereign. You'd probably have to partner with a sovereign to help you in your path of becoming anti-fragile and, kind of like, you're turning into a cockroach. Like right now, if you are just domiciled in one country and using fiat, like you have no sovereignty, right? So you're just trying to claw some of that back. And again, like we're already seeing, nation states push big multinational network effect tech companies pushing the boundaries on sovereignty. And that's, again, why I think that that's going to be where it, first really instrumentalizes itself. But individuals like you and I, small businesses holding their Bitcoin, holding their funds in Bitcoin, starting to domicile in different nation states, diversify which jurisdictions they're exposed to, that, on a grand scheme, that is also going to be huge and kind of forcing the hand of different nation states to start becoming more competitive and to start, trying to do what they can to compete rather than resting on their laurels. So it's very exciting.
Can we work through that idea that, you talk about, I'm not big enough to be self-sovereign. It really is those who have to dominate their markets. But the idea of the sovereign individual is that you can be self-sovereign as an individual. So why as a company is that different?
Well, I mean, it's like the long game, sure. Individuals will become self-sovereign, and I think that there's already self-sovereign individuals. Like this is probably someone who's typically frowned upon, but I would consider Vladimir Putin to be like one of the only sovereign individuals today. Maybe the head of North Korea. I mean, you could point to several like quote-unquote dictators. Like, yeah, they are sovereign, right? But using these techniques to become more anti-fragile, more censorship resistant as a company, as individuals, those same techniques can be used by bigger entities, and they themselves, again, can start, like I consider the bar is you need to be able to start competing with a nation state directly. That is sovereignty. And nation states are going to shrink because of this technology, but we're going to see alternative organizations grow. Ultimately, there can be people that achieve sovereign individual status. They'll probably be leading these companies.
But is what you're saying is that as long as you're ruled by some form of nation state under some form of government rules, you can't essentially be sovereign.
Yeah. I mean, you're just shopping around, and that's going to help you become more sovereign, claim sovereignty. But to be a full sovereign individual, a full sovereignty, you need an enormous amount of power, right? Nation state level power.
It's on a gradient, right, guys? Like we talked about earlier. It's not sovereign, not sovereign. First of all, there's different domains in life where you may have more or less sovereignty. And the definition, by the way, I think is important here. I forget the name of the guy who said the quote, but he said that sovereign is he who decides the exception. So it's when you get to decide, there's a general rule or guideline that we're using to interoperate, but whoever gets to decide the exception to that rule effectively has sovereignty. So in these certain areas, right, with Bitcoin specifically, if you're in a fiat regime and the tax man says your funds are frozen, you need to go to court now to try to fight and get them back, you cannot claim any exception. You have no levers to pull, right, to protect yourself. But if you're in Bitcoin and that happens, there's not really anything they can do. You actually have full control over those funds. You maintain the exception. So they try to enforce a rule on you, but you have the exception to go anywhere else in the world. So that gives you sovereignty over your monetary wealth or energy. And so I think again, the theme here is that the less attached you are to a locality, right? Because if you're rooted in a locality and you need whatever it is, you need to send your kids to that school or you need to source your tin from that mine, you have to be physically present in this place to run your life or run your business. That is what subjects you to the dominion of the monopoly on violence that's locally predominant. But the more, say, informational, I guess, your business or your life, the more sovereign you can be in the digital age, right? Like you, Peter, you're just running a podcast. You could really do it anywhere in the world. Your team's already distributed. Your capital's already in Bitcoin. Like you're pretty much all the way there. You just would kind of have to leave UK and go negotiate maybe another better tax treatment somewhere. But that the last piece is what I think Christian's getting to is you need a little bit more size or weight to be able to go today at least and actually go negotiate a more favorable tax treaty with a different jurisdiction, right? You're not really going to get that treatment as a smaller individual or small business, but over time, as states are shrinking and individuals are growing in power, this negotiating leverage becomes a little more equalized between state and individual.
Yes, and it's a couple of interesting points there because I've moved the company money predominantly into Bitcoin. I hold 6 weeks fiat cash flow. I've moved personal money. Well, I'm essentially over 100% now because I'm leveraged. So I have sovereignty over my money. I've also, with my team, I've now said you can be paid any amount in Bitcoin, and I've had responses from 5 to 20%, of their income coming in Bitcoin because they're still going to pay fiat bills. My weaknesses now, my real weaknesses are any form of, I don't know, government pressure onto the platforms which host my content, because that would be, if Apple and Spotify were forced to remove my content, yes, I could find someone on the dark web to host it and make it available, but I'm going to suddenly, where I've done, say I'm doing 750,000 downloads this month, next month I might do 100,000. So it really kills that part of the business. That's my current weakness. Are there other technologies, therefore, that are going to become important alongside Bitcoin for this?
So let me jump in here. I think that's a great example, and we're in this state of transition, right? Personally, when I see Bitcoin as the impotence for the personal server revolution. And right now, we are very, very much dependent on centralized cloud providers that are not sovereign, that are all kind of under the guy. They're kind of trapped by the nation state. So kind of seeing how, more and more of our society starts to kind of own their own hardware and starts to run their own, stuff. That is gonna, again, we're in this process of shrinking the power of the nation state and growing the power of the individual. So, I mean, it's a process, absolutely. And yes, you as a information business very well could be completely smothered, even though you still have access to your funds and your freedom. It's a very easy way for you to kind of be smothered on the internet, but that is changing. And, we've seen Donald Trump get deplatformed, and guess what? He's on Gab.com. He's on other places, and those places don't have nearly as much pull as Twitter, but their importance and their relevance is increasing as well. As we keep seeing more and more people get marginalized because of the growth of the state, we're also seeing kind of the incentive to self-host, to go to alternatives, and those alternatives are going to become more significant. So I just think it's part of a process, and really, Bitcoin is the key that is unlocking, incentivizing, and enabling all of this. And that's why, if you're talking about this kind of stuff, you have to talk about Bitcoin. Like, Bitcoin is fundamental and necessary.
But even with Parler and Gab.com, they could still face the same pressures. They could still censor Donald Trump if they want. I think what I'm getting at is, is there like a need for other decentralized technologies? Obviously, that don't need tokens and bullshit like that, but that enable people to host their business, host content.
I call it self-hosting. Yeah, just running your own hardware. That makes you censorship resistant and anti-fragile. But it's just the impotence for it, and the network effects around that are still growing.
So I was going to say, I think there's a lot of interesting projects to this end, but you're absolutely right. If we're going to have a society that is premised on the free speech, which is basically what Western civilization is, right? That the ideas of anyone should be free to rectify kind of the way we organize ourselves. Then we need, in the same way we have immutable money now with Bitcoin, that we can express and receive value without any interference, we need that for information as well, which is kind of interesting that we sort of got it with the internet in the beginning, that we had these, and we do have it still, we have these immutable protocols, more or less, like at different layers of the internet stack, like TCP/IP or HTTP. But at the application layer, we don't have it, right? The application layer is permissioned, and that's where you see these games being played, where the president of the U.S. is getting censored off of Twitter and other social media platforms. So I think what we need is this, as as Christian called it, self-sovereign compute or self-hosting. And there's a few projects that are interesting to that end. The Urbit project, very ambitious, but would allow people to basically take total sovereignty over their own digital existence. I think that we might actually see a lot of this be re-architected on top of Bitcoin. Maybe we'll see something like a Lightning protocol-based messaging service. I know, Peter, you've done a podcast that was really interesting with a guy talking about the impact of the Lightning Network on podcasting.
Yeah, Adam Curry.
Yeah, and we could possibly see even social media platforms develop there to where it becomes a true free speech digital platform, right? No one, again, if we're back to sovereign is he who can make the exception, just like with Bitcoin, no one can make an exception to the database or the core rule set. Therefore, all users are basically maximally sovereign. We need that. We need those platforms to really get this digital age going towards its I guess, libertarian promise.
It's a fascinating transitional phase. Like, I don't know about you, Christian, but you're kind of watching these things play out step by step. Things that people have predicted, things I've read about, a lot of stuff I read about on Nakamoto Institute when I first got into Bitcoin. I was like, yeah, all right, whatever. This is digital money, I get it, but come on. Like, we're actually seeing all the pieces of this kind of start to play out now.
Yeah, and honestly, that's why I really recommend reading the book, because once you kind of read The Sovereign Individual, I mean, there's a lot of other great resources out there, people thinking in first principles like Pierre and Michael Bitstein with Nakamoto, or the Nakamoto Institute. But once you kind of see it from the perspective of this is what moving on to the digital high seas is going to do to the world, and then we are actually living in that transition, like, Marty Bent called 2020 the year of clarity at the beginning of 2020, and I fully believe it was the year of clarity. It showed us how free we are. It showed us the nature of our government. It showed us so many things, and kind of having the purview of being a Bitcoiner, have read several books that have kind of like thought through this transition to moving into the digital high seas, and then actually watching it. It's an amazing show and a lot of popcorn for sure.
Are we not, like, as a group of Bitcoiners, like this little weird part of the internet, and our ideas are actually a little bit radical, and the rest of the world are looking at us going, what the fuck are these people on about? Or do you think right now, like, this stuff is actually something, like, is a radical idea that is becoming mainstream?
Well, if the market is, price is truth, and Bitcoin is the fastest growing asset in human history, I'd say there is some grain of truth to what we're talking about. And you're right that we are maybe this radical niche side of the internet talking about these, crazy, colossal ideas like the downfall of the nation state. But that's exactly what digital technology is that it enables us to transmute our imagination into reality more quickly than ever. And so, if you get into like deep Austrian first principles, it's all about the free flow of information and goods, right? That is the ideal market space. And the less inhibited it is by any interference, specifically government interference, the better it is for everyone, the more wealth it creates for everyone. And I'm literally rereading Human Action right now, and some of the things I read by Mises in 1949, I'm like, he just described the sovereign individual thesis. He just described the digital age. He just described Bitcoin. So it's as if all of these things, they've been in the human, collective human imagination or psyche for some time, but they're just now able to be expressed with digital technology. And I think we're living through an actual, I don't know the actual word for it, but a renaissance of some sorts, where we're at a very what the book would call a mega political transition, where we're going from an industrial age into a digital age. And it's maybe hard to comprehend the profundity of that up close, but it could be so extreme, to look back on this in a couple of hundred years and think that we actually lived through it. We're actually blazing trail here that we didn't even understand at the time. So it's kind of like as we push out onto these digital high seas, we are, we had the ruthless capitalists or whatever they say that dominated the 20th century. Maybe we become the sovereignists that dominate the 21st century.
But it's a lot easier to be rational with retrospect. I mean, this is no different from the early stages of the agricultural revolution, the early stages of the industrial revolution. And I'm sure there's some people who spotted what was happening, and others who just kind of like went along for the ride, or didn't accept it. And I know the book talks about like the digital revolution, which is this. I keep thinking that perhaps you're right. Perhaps we are living in that moment, and in like 100 years, 200 years, they'll be teaching this in the, well, not in the government school books because it'll be no government, but do you know what I mean? This will be like part of history where we transitioned away from the nation state. And it's like, look at that weird time where we had these armies and nations that ruled over people, and Bitcoin was the thing that enabled it. So Christian, look, before we close out, I still think there's going to be some people listening to this and going, I get it. I get emails all the time from people, all different subjects. Well, I talk about my business and putting money in Bitcoin. I'll get like 10, 20 emails saying, oh, how'd you do that? I want to do that for my company. There's going to be people with, certainly I think it's going to appeal to people with small businesses, distributed businesses, online businesses who are thinking, I need my business to become more self-sovereign. And I would say there's two reasons to do it, not just a defense against the state, but actually I think it gives you a competitive business advantage. Certainly making my business primarily Bitcoin based has given me just capital alone has given me a lot of advantage. I can launch new extensions on my business a lot easier these days. If somebody's thinking about this, where would you direct them? In terms of things to think about, what they should be reading. Obviously, you're going to tell them to read the book, but what else should they be thinking about?
Okay, well, I mean, I would say that just owning Bitcoin is not enough, and just owning exposure to Bitcoin is not enough. Really, what I outline in the article is 3 steps to self-sovereignty. Number 1 is you need to hold your wealth in Bitcoin, a censorship-resistant, inflation-resistant store of value money. Next step is you actually have to hold and validate your own Bitcoin, right? So if when you hold your Bitcoin in a custodian, like, yes, you kind of don't have to deal with some of the personal responsibility required to safely custody keys, but you also forego many of Bitcoin's censorship resistant features that kind of enable you to become more anti-fragile. And then lastly, and I think most importantly, is this jurisdictional arbitrage facet, right? Ultimately, holding your own keys and holding your value in Bitcoin enables you to better take advantage of jurisdictional arbitrage, which is, in my opinion, the key of this whole revolution, and the key and the main thesis of the sovereign individual is jurisdictional competition. It's no longer being trapped in the jurisdiction that you're born in and having the ability to vote with your feet. So you need all 3 components. You need to hold your value in Bitcoin, censorship-resistant, anti-fragile money. You need to validate and hold those keys yourself, and then so that way you actually have the value. You're not trusting anyone. And then you need to set your business up in a way that you take advantage of, multiple jurisdictions or a jurisdiction that is going to give you guarantees. But that jurisdictional arbitrage aspect is super important. And the beautiful thing about uploading the economy in 2020 to the digital high seas, I'm going to start using that, Robert, because I think it's a really apt analogy. But once you've uploaded to the digital high seas, like, guess what? You can kind of find your post and you can broadcast everywhere. You can serve the entire world. And it really does not matter where you are jurisdictionally. You don't have to be in this kind of, metropolitan hub anymore, because the internet is the metropolitan hub. So you can't be a sovereign company without those second 2 factors of holding your keys and jurisdictional arbitrage. But again, I just think that all of them logically make sense, and ultimately Bitcoin enables that jurisdictional arbitrage, which is it's so extremely exciting.
Nice. Breedlove, you got any final comments? Anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with all those points. I mean, you can't hold paper Bitcoin and think that you're self-sovereign, because you're just assuming counterparty risk. Again, your counterparty gets to decide the exception, right? If they disappear with your Bitcoin, or they get hacked, or they go bankrupt, then you're dead in the water. Like, you've got to hold your own Bitcoin. You've got to run your own node. I would add to that too, that to play this game of jurisdictional arbitrage, you really need citizenship optionality. A lot of people call this multi-flag theory. This is sort of a new space I'm exploring myself, but just figuring out, if things go south in your home, right? If the UK, for you, Peter, just gets super draconian overnight, or they enforce some law that's just not acceptable, what do you do? Like, what's your plan B? Where do you go next?
Katie the
It's a
Russian.
lot. Yeah, it's a lot easier if you have prepared for that, right? If you already have an alternative passport or visa or whatever to another country versus trying to scramble in the moment that everyone's rushing for the exits, right? This is the Talebian. Everyone's rushing to exit the theater, and there's the door is just kind of one size. Like you end up bidding a lot more to get out. So it's better to do it in advance than do it in the moment. And if you want to go even further out on that self-sovereignty spectrum, I think the 3D printing of everything is interesting, but specifically firearms. The fact that we can now print firearms to protect ourselves from predation is really interesting. I think that'll be increasingly relevant to the symmetry of violence going forward. And then I think taking, just general survivalist courses. Like, I'm not trying to sound tinfoil hat doom and gloom here, but like it doesn't hurt to be prepared for all possible outcomes. Because I think the big thing here with the sovereign individual thesis is that the ultimate outcome is actually quite a beautiful world. Like, we're a lot more free, we have a lot more wealth, we have a lot more control over our own lives, but the transition is highly uncertain. We don't really know what that looks like going from the centralized model to the decentralized model. So in that transition, you really just need to be prepared for all eventualities. So
Yeah, I don't disagree. That I think that's the bit that I think about a lot. Is the transition itself is likely bloody. The transition away from the state not accepting things is likely bloody. Is likely a revolution, and then the early kind of stages of organizing yourself with with a smaller or if no state itself will likely be bloody. That it would likely be a scenario where there's a lot of figuring out of how this actually works. So very interesting. Well, listen, look, appreciate you both coming on. Breedlove, we're going to follow this up. We're going to do the sovereign individual itself. Like I said, I'm 3/4 of the way through it. It's taken a long time because I'm going through slowly. I'm keeping a lot of notes and I'm repeating a lot of sections, but I'm looking forward to covering that. Christian, it's been great fun to get you on the show. I'm going to share the article you wrote out in the show notes. Everyone should check it out. Christian, if people want to follow you, where can they do that?
Yeah, guys. So I'm very active on Twitter at CK_snarks. Starting to play around with Clubhouse as well. Same handle at CK_snarks. And I'm leading things up over at Bitcoin Magazine. So, of course, for everything Bitcoin related and a lot of the best articles and thought leadership, both these guys have contributed to. Go check out bitcoinmagazine.com. And yeah, I got to plug the conference, Bitcoin 2021, b.tc/conference. That's where you can get your tickets to the Bitcoin conference in Miami this June 4th and 5th. Super, super excited for that. Bitcoin 2019 was an absolutely fantastic event. Companies that are making a huge impact in the space were formed there, and we're hoping to repeat and do it bigger and badder in Miami this year.
Nice one. Well, I'm hoping I can get over. I'm hoping the planes will be flying at that point. Breedlove, how do people follow you?
yeah, you can find me on Twitter as well, at Breedlove22, BREEDLOVE22. And then just launched the What is Money show. So it's kind of a podcast and YouTube channel. You can find that at whatismoneypodcast.com or just search it on YouTube.
Brilliant. Look, love you both. Appreciate having you both on. Hopefully we'll meet up in person soon because it's been far too long. Christian, I used to get to see you every couple of months and now it's been over a year. So hopefully soon enough, guys. Take care. Appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks,
Cheers,
Christian.
Peter. Thank you.